Have you ever noticed how your chest tightens when you walk into a room filled with tension, even before anyone speaks a word? Your nervous system responds like a smoke detector to emotional frequencies invisible to others, sensing distress that hasn't even been verbally expressed yet, while those around you remain oblivious. Your body bears witness to the unspoken suffering hanging heavy in the air, like humidity before a storm. You are not imagining this heightened sensitivity. You are not being dramatic about your overwhelming responses to others' pain, and you are not losing your mind when you feel emotionally exhausted after social gatherings where everyone else seems energized. What society celebrates as your gift of empathy may actually be the psychological scar tissue of a childhood that demanded you become fluent in survival through emotional servitude. Your remarkable ability to absorb and process the feelings of others likely crystallized not from some mystical blessing, but from developmental years where expressing your own needs felt dangerous or selfish. The renowned psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung recognized that what we admire as exceptional sensitivity often conceals a profound betrayal of the authentic self, where a child learned to abandon their natural selfishness in exchange for acceptance. Jung discovered that beneath the surface of every highly empathetic individual lives an inner child who was never permitted the healthy narcissism essential for psychological development. This child within you absorbed a terrible lesson that your worth depended entirely on dissolving your own boundaries to serve others' emotional needs, transforming natural childhood self-centeredness into a source of shame rather than healthy identity formation. Your hypervigilance to emotional atmospheres developed because this inner child learned that prioritizing your own feelings carried real consequences for safety and belonging. But what Jung uncovered about the relationship between childhood emotional suppression and adult empathic overwhelm reveals a startling pathway back to the wholeness that was interrupted decades ago. In the labyrinth of your own mind, there exists a chamber you have never dared to enter. It pulses with a rhythm you recognize yet cannot name. Beats with a pain that feels familiar yet remains unspoken. This chamber houses the fragments of yourself that were sacrificed long before you knew what sacrifice meant. Within this forgotten sanctuary lives the version of you who once believed they mattered simply by existing, before the world taught you that survival meant becoming invisible. Jung called this the process by which we learn to abandon ourselves in order to be accepted by others, the slow dismantling of authentic selfhood in exchange for conditional love. Your emotional receptivity, this ability to absorb the pain of others like a living sponge, did not emerge from some cosmic gift bestowed upon your spirit. Instead, it crystallized within the crucible of necessity, forged by circumstances that demanded you become fluent in the language of everyone else's suffering, while forgetting the dialect of your own needs. The child who sits within your adult body learned a terrible arithmetic, that their worth equaled their usefulness to others. This mathematical equation became so deeply embedded in your nervous system that even now, decades later, your body reacts to others' distress as if it were your own emergency. In Jungian psychology, we understand this as the formation of a false persona, a mask crafted not for deception, but for survival. The mask became so convincing that you forgot the face beneath it, so comfortable that removing it now feels like tearing away skin rather than simply discarding a costume. What we commonly celebrate as emotional sensitivity often masks a profound disconnection from the self, a learned pattern of emotional eavesdropping that developed when authentic expression was too dangerous to risk. The shadow, that repository of all we have rejected within ourselves, grows thick with unexpressed anger in those who have been praised for their selflessness. In the darkness of this shadow realm accumulate the screams you swallowed, the boundaries you never drew, the times you said yes when your entire being longed to say no. Jung understood that what we refuse to acknowledge within ourselves does not disappear, but instead takes on a life of its own, operating from the unconscious and controlling our choices in ways we cannot perceive. For the overly empathetic individual, the shadow often contains the very selfishness they were taught to fear, the healthy narcissism that every developing child requires to form a solid sense of identity. The archetypal child within you, the one Jung described as carrying the potential for wholeness and renewal, found itself denied access to what he termed the natural selfishness of youth. This child was forced to mature too quickly, to read the emotional weather of adults with the precision of a meteorologist, to become a tiny therapist in a household where emotional regulation was your unspoken responsibility. The individuation process, Jung's term for the journey toward psychological wholeness, cannot begin until we acknowledge the parts of ourselves we have disowned. For those who have been applauded for their empathic abilities, the most challenging aspect of individuation involves reclaiming their right to exist without constantly serving others. This is not the crude selfishness that harms others, but the sacred selfishness that recognizes your own existence as worthy of protection and nurturing. Ring that notification bell now, and check the description below for resources that will guide you deeper into Jung's revolutionary understanding of the psyche, because what we are exploring together challenges everything you have been taught about kindness and its costs. The collective unconscious, Jung's most profound discovery, contains patterns of behavior and imagery that repeat across all human cultures. Among these universal patterns lies the archetype of the wounded healer, the individual who develops extraordinary sensitivity to others' pain as a direct result of their own unprocessed trauma. This archetype manifests in those who become so skilled at tending others' wounds that they lose track of their own bleeding, who develop such acute awareness of others' needs that their own requirements fade into invisibility. The anima and animus, Jung's terms for the contrasexual elements within the psyche, become distorted in individuals who have learned to prioritize others' emotional states above their own. The inner feminine, regardless of biological gender, which should provide intuitive wisdom about one's own needs and desires, instead becomes hyper-attuned to external emotional climates. The inner masculine, which should offer protective boundaries and the ability to say no, atrophies from disuse, leaving the individual defensively vulnerable to emotional manipulation and energetic drain. Symbols emerge from the unconscious mind, through dreams and fantasies, and Jung paid careful attention to the recurring imagery that appears in the psychological material of empathic individuals. Frequently, such people dream of empty houses they cannot leave, suggesting a sense of psychological imprisonment within a hollow identity. They dream of crying children locked in attics, representing the abandoned inner child whose needs were never met. They dream of mirrors with no reflection, symbolizing the loss of individual identity that occurs when one exists primarily as a vessel for others' emotions. The process Jung called active imagination. The conscious dialogue with unconscious content becomes especially crucial for those who have lost touch with their authentic emotional responses. Through this practice, the overgrown helper can begin to distinguish between their genuine feelings and the emotional states they have absorbed from others. The shadow material that emerges during this process often includes shocking amounts of rage, resentment, and yes, healthy selfishness that was banished from consciousness but never truly eliminated. In the mythology of various cultures, we find the archetype of the pharmakos, the scapegoat who carries the collective pain of the community. Jung recognized that individuals often unconsciously assume this role within their families and social circles, becoming repositories for unprocessed emotions that others refuse to face. The psychological cost of this role is immense, as the individual becomes so identified with suffering that they lose touch with their capacity for joy, so focused on healing others that they forget their own wounds require attention. The transcendent function, Jung's term for the psychological mechanism that bridges conscious and unconscious content, operates differently in those who have developed premature empathic abilities. Instead of facilitating their own psychological development, this function becomes primarily oriented toward understanding and managing others' psychological states. The result is a sophisticated understanding of human psychology applied everywhere, except to their own inner world, a therapeutic skill set that remains perpetually externally focused. Dreams often reveal the hunger of the abandoned self, the parts of the personality that were sacrificed for acceptance and approval. Jung emphasized that every dream compensates for attitudes in waking consciousness, and in empathic individuals, dreams frequently feature images of feeding and nourishment that cannot be obtained, suggesting the deep starvation of the authentic self that has been ignored in favor of nourishing others. The recognition that empathic sensitivity often develops as a trauma response rather than a spiritual gift represents a crucial turning point in the individuation process. This recognition does not diminish the value of compassion, but rather locates its authentic source, distinguishing between empathy that flows from wholeness and empathy that flows from woundedness. True compassion, Jung suggested, emerges not from the need to be needed, but from an overflow of inner fullness. The path forward requires what Jung called the transcendence of opposites, the integration of seemingly contradictory aspects of the personality. The empathic individual must learn to hold both compassion and boundaries, both service and self-care, both giving and receiving. This integration cannot be achieved through mental understanding alone, but requires a fundamental shift in how one relates to their own emotional experience. The individuation journey for the chronic helper involves a descent into their own psychological underworld, a willingness to face the rage and grief they have carried silently for others, and the courage to disappoint those who have become accustomed to their self-sacrifice. This descent is not about becoming less compassionate, but about discovering what genuine compassion looks like when it flows from choice rather than compulsion, from strength rather than depletion. As we prepare to venture deeper into the mechanisms by which this transformation occurs, remember that the goal is not to eliminate your capacity for empathy, but to liberate it from the prison of unconscious compulsion. What awaits in our continued exploration will illuminate the practical methods Jung developed for reclaiming the abandoned self and establishing the boundaries necessary for authentic compassion to flourish. The relationships that drain your spirit arrive with mathematical precision, drawn to the unhealed spaces within your emotional architecture. They recognize the scent of your unconscious willingness to dissolve boundaries, to absorb pain that was never meant to be yours. These connections recreate the original betrayal with startling accuracy, offering you the same impossible equation that shaped your earliest understanding of love. If you become essential to their emotional survival, perhaps you will finally receive the unconditional acceptance that was withheld from your developing self. Yet this represents not love, but repetition compulsion, the psyche's desperate attempt to resolve an ancient wound through modern reenactment. The wounded healer archetype manifests most clearly in romantic partnerships where your empathic abilities become the foundation of attraction. Partners unconsciously select you not for your wholeness, but for your capacity to carry what they cannot face within themselves. Your nervous system, trained from childhood to monitor emotional weather patterns, becomes their early warning system for psychological storms. The relationship transforms into an elaborate therapeutic contract where your healing abilities serve their unconscious resistance to growth. This dynamic perpetuates because both parties remain unconscious of the archetypal roles being enacted beneath the surface of ordinary interaction. Dreams of empathic individuals frequently contain recurring symbolic elements that reveal the psychological cost of this emotional servitude. Empty rooms that stretch endlessly suggest a self that has been hollowed out to make space for others' psychological material. Broken mirrors reflect the fragmentation of identity that occurs when one exists primarily as a vessel for external emotional content. Children trapped behind locked doors represent aspects of your authentic nature that were sealed away when spontaneous expression became dangerous. These dream images are not random psychological debris, but precise communications from the unconscious about the current state of your inner world. The collective unconscious contains universal patterns of psychological development that apply regardless of cultural or individual differences. Among these patterns lies the pharmakos, the scapegoat figure who carries collective pain to protect the community from facing its own darkness. In family systems, empathic individuals often unconsciously assume this archetypal role, becoming repositories for unprocessed trauma that spans generations. The psychological cost involves losing touch with personal joy, while becoming intimately familiar with inherited patterns of suffering and dysfunction. Breaking free from this role requires recognizing that your empathic sensitivity developed as an adaptive response rather than a spiritual calling. The anima and animus, representing the inner masculine and feminine principles, become distorted when empathic abilities develop through trauma rather than wholeness. The inner feminine, which should provide intuitive guidance about personal needs and desires, instead becomes hyper-attuned to external emotional climates. The inner masculine, meant to offer protective boundaries and assertive capacity, atrophies from disuse, leaving you vulnerable to psychological invasion. This imbalance creates a perpetual state of emotional reactivity, where your inner world mirrors the chaos of those around you. Restoring balance requires consciously developing the neglected aspects of your psychological nature, particularly the capacity for healthy selfishness. Active imagination, Jung's method for conscious dialogue with unconscious content, becomes essential for those who have lost touch with their authentic emotional responses. Through this practice, you begin distinguishing between feelings that originate within your own psyche and emotional states absorbed from external sources. The shadow material that emerges during this process often includes shocking amounts of rage, resentment, and self-protective instincts that were banished from consciousness. These rejected aspects of personality are not evil, but represent vital psychological functions that were suppressed for survival reasons. Integration involves acknowledging these shadow elements without being overwhelmed by them, recognizing their legitimate place within your complete psychological nature. The transcendent function operates differently in individuals whose empathic abilities developed prematurely as survival mechanisms rather than natural psychological unfolding. Instead of facilitating personal psychological development, this function becomes oriented toward understanding and managing others' internal states. The result involves sophisticated psychological insight applied everywhere except to your own inner world, creating a therapeutic blindness toward personal needs. Dreams reveal the hunger of abandoned aspects of personality, often featuring images of nourishment that cannot be obtained or consumed. These dreams compensate for waking consciousness that prioritizes feeding others while ignoring the starvation of your authentic self. Recognizing empathic sensitivity as a trauma response rather than a spiritual gift represents a crucial turning point in psychological development. This recognition does not diminish the value of compassion, but locates its authentic source, distinguishing between empathy that flows from wholeness versus woundedness. True compassion emerges not from the compulsive need to be needed, but from an overflow of inner fullness and psychological integration. The individuation journey requires transcending the apparent opposition between compassion and self-care, service and personal boundaries, giving and receiving. This integration cannot be achieved through intellectual understanding alone, but demands a fundamental shift in how you relate to your own emotional experience. The chronic helper must descend into their own psychological underworld, confronting rage and grief carried silently for others throughout their lifetime. This descent involves the courage to disappoint those who have become accustomed to your self-sacrifice, risking relationships built on psychological inequality. The goal involves not eliminating empathic capacity, but liberating it from the prison of unconscious compulsion, allowing choice rather than automatic response. What emerges resembles genuine compassion, flowing from strength rather than depletion, from conscious choice rather than psychological programming. The transformed empath no longer serves as an emotional regulator for the unhealed, but offers the world their truth rather than their servitude. Consciousness carries choice, and choice represents the seed of authentic freedom from patterns that once ensured survival, but now prevent psychological growth. Your healing journey begins the moment you choose conscious selfishness over unconscious self-abandonment, recognizing that wholeness serves the world more than martyrdom ever could.